Louis Henkin was one of the most influential legal scholars of the 20th century, particularly in the fields of constitutional law, international law, and human rights. His book, The Age of Rights, published in 1990, is a cornerstone in the study of human rights and their evolution in modern legal and political thought. Henkin argues that human rights have become the dominant moral and legal framework of contemporary global politics, shaping international relations, national policies, and legal interpretations of justice. Henkin's work is particularly significant because it provides a comprehensive analysis of the philosophical, legal, and political foundations of human rights. He explores how human rights have evolved from theoretical ideals to practical principles that influence governance and diplomacy. By examining historical developments, international treaties, and domestic legal systems, Henkin presents a compelling case for the universal acceptance of human rights. In this essay, we will explore Henkin's arguments in The Age of Rights, analyzing the development of human rights, the role of international law, the challenges to their implementation, and their relevance in the modern world. The evolution of human rights. Henkin begins his book by tracing the historical development of human rights. He argues that while the idea of rights has existed in various forms for centuries, the modern conception of human rights emerged after World War II. The atrocities of the war, particularly the Holocaust, highlighted the need for an international framework to protect individuals from state oppression. This led to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, in 1948, which Henkin considers a defining moment in the global human rights movement. Prior to the 20th century, rights were largely tied to citizenship and national legal systems. The American and French revolutions of the late 18th century emphasized individual freedoms and democratic governance, but these rights were often limited to certain groups within society. Henkin argues that the post-war era marked a transition from national rights to universal rights, recognizing that all individuals, regardless of nationality, are entitled to fundamental freedoms. Henkin also discusses the development of international human rights treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICR. He highlights how these legal instruments have expanded the scope of human rights, making them enforceable on a global scale. The role of international law in human rights. One of Henkin's key arguments in The Age of Rights is that international law has played a crucial role in the institutionalization of human rights. He explains that while human rights were traditionally considered a domestic issue, they have increasingly become a matter of international concern. This shift is evident in the creation of organizations such as the United Nations, which monitors human rights violations and holds states accountable. Henkin emphasizes the importance of legal mechanisms that enforce human rights standards. He discusses the role of international courts, such as the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, in adjudicating human rights cases. These institutions provide individuals with legal recourse when their rights are violated, reinforcing the idea that human rights transcend national sovereignty. However, Henkin acknowledges the challenges in enforcing international human rights law. He points out that while many countries have ratified human rights treaties, compliance is often inconsistent. Some governments sign treaties for diplomatic reasons but fail to implement them domestically. Additionally, international law relies on state cooperation, making enforcement difficult when powerful nations choose to ignore human rights obligations. Despite these challenges, Henkin remains optimistic about the role of international law in advancing human rights. He argues that the growing acceptance of human rights norms creates pressure on governments to comply, even if enforcement mechanisms remain weak. The moral and legal authority of human rights, he suggests, is often enough to influence state behavior. The universality of human rights. A central theme in The Age of Rights is the universality of human rights. Henkin strongly opposes cultural relativist arguments that claim human rights are a Western concept imposed on other societies. He argues that while different cultures have unique traditions and values, fundamental human rights are universal and should apply to all individuals. Henkin supports his argument by highlighting the broad international consensus on human rights. He points out that the UDHR and other human rights treaties have been endorsed by countries from diverse cultural backgrounds. While there may be variations in how rights are implemented, the core principles of dignity, freedom, and equality are widely accepted. He also challenges the notion that human rights conflict with cultural or religious traditions. Instead, he argues that many cultures have long-standing traditions of justice and fairness that align with human rights principles. He acknowledges that tensions may arise between cultural practices and human rights standards, but he insists that human dignity should always take precedence. Henkin's stance on universality is particularly relevant in contemporary debates on human rights. Issues such as gender equality, freedom of speech, and LGBTQ+ rights continue to be contested in various societies. Henkin's work serves as a reminder that human rights should not be subject to political or cultural justifications for discrimination. Challenges to human rights implementation. While Henkin is a strong advocate for human rights, he does not ignore the difficulties in their implementation. He identifies several key challenges that hinder the realization of human rights worldwide. 1. State sovereignty versus human rights. Henkin recognizes that the principle of state sovereignty often conflicts with human rights enforcement. Many governments resist external interference in their domestic affairs, making it difficult for international institutions to address human rights violations. Authoritarian regimes in particular use sovereignty as a shield against accountability. 2. Political will and enforcement. Even in democratic countries, political will plays a crucial role in the protection of human rights. Henkin notes that economic and political interests often take precedence over human rights concerns. For example, powerful countries may overlook human rights abuses in allied nations to maintain strategic relationships. 3. Economic disparities and social rights. Henkin acknowledges the challenges in implementing economic and social rights, such as access to education, healthcare, and employment. Unlike civil and political rights, which require governments to refrain from interference, social rights demand active state intervention and resources. He argues that global economic inequalities make it difficult for some countries to fully implement these rights. 4. Conflicts and human rights violations. Wars and internal conflicts pose significant threats to human rights. Henkin discusses how human rights are often disregarded during times of crisis, with governments justifying repressive measures in the name of national security. He highlights the need for stronger international mechanisms to protect human rights during conflicts. Despite these challenges, Henkin remains hopeful that human rights will continue to advance. He emphasizes the role of civil society, human rights organizations, and international pressure in holding governments accountable. Conclusion. Louis Henkin's The Age of Rights is a profound exploration of the philosophical, legal, and political dimensions of human rights. He convincingly argues that human rights have become the moral language of our time, shaping international law, domestic policies, and global discourse. Henkin's analysis of the historical evolution of human rights, the role of international law, and the challenges to their implementation provides a comprehensive understanding of the subject. His defense of universality remains particularly relevant as debates over cultural relativism and state sovereignty continue to shape human rights discussions. While Henkin acknowledges the difficulties in enforcing human rights, he remains optimistic about their future. He believes that the moral force of human rights, combined with legal and political mechanisms, will continue to drive progress. In an era where human rights are increasingly under threat from authoritarianism, economic inequality, and global conflicts, Henkin's work serves as a crucial reminder of the importance of defending human dignity. In conclusion, The Age of Rights is not just a legal treatise, but a call to action. Henkin's arguments challenge us to recognize human rights as a fundamental aspect of justice and to work towards their realization for all people, regardless of nationality, culture, or political system. His vision of a world where human rights are respected and upheld remains a powerful aspiration for scholars, policymakers, and activists alike. Let me